Have you ever witnessed an injustice so blatant it made your heart race with both anger and anticipation, wondering if the truth would ever see the light of day? Today, I'm sharing a jaw-dropping tale about a small-town officer who went too far and the ordinary woman who refused to be crushed. When this racist cop arrested a black woman under the flimsiest of pretenses, he believed he'd remain untouchable until a secret detail about her life unraveled everything. From shocking revelations to dramatic reversals of fate, this story is packed with twists that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Philadelphia has always been a city of vibrant contrasts, nestled within its centuries-old architecture and bustling neighborhoods. From the Liberty Bell to the Philadelphia Eagles, it's a place known for its pride in history and unyielding spirit. Yet, behind the scenes of independence and brotherly love, the complexities of prejudice and race sometimes rear their ugly heads. This tale begins in one of Philadelphia's quieter corners, in a residential area near the edges of Fairmount Park, a place both scenic and rich in local lore, yet often overlooked by tourists who prefer more famous landmarks. On a crisp autumn morning, Janella Carter awakened to the early light dancing through the blinds of her modest second-floor studio apartment. She stretched her arms, yawned, and quietly thanked the universe for the new day. Janella was the kind of woman who believed in morning gratitude. From a young age, she'd been raised by a grandmother who insisted that each sunrise was a gift. Growing up on limited means in a low-income neighborhood of South Philadelphia, Janella had learned to savor every shred of kindness and hope in her daily life. She worked two jobs, one as a part-time office assistant at a small law firm near City Hall, the other as a weekend cashier at a local grocery store. Despite the financial juggling act, she found a way to keep her spirits high, always determined to forge a better future. That same morning, in another part of the city, a man named Officer Robert Zimmerman put on his crisp Philadelphia Police Department uniform. He adjusted his belt, checked his holster, and felt a familiar surge of pride in seeing his reflection in the mirror. Zimmerman had always wanted to be a policeman. His father, grandfather, and several uncles had served in various police departments across Pennsylvania. Growing up, he was told that wearing the badge meant upholding the law and protecting the community. But somewhere along the line, the virtue of service had twisted into something more sinister in his mind. A simmering bitterness had taken root, shaped by years of small frustrations that he blamed on those people, a general label he used for anyone who didn't look or talk like him. Robert Zimmerman was known in certain circles for being heavy-handed in his arrests and unyielding in his judgments, particularly where race was concerned. He believed in a narrative that crime was concentrated in certain neighborhoods by certain communities and felt no shame in making his suspicions or scorn obvious. On that autumn day, fate aligned in an unfortunate way. Janella needed to head to a local government office to file some paperwork. Her grandmother had left her a small piece of property in North Philadelphia, but it was entangled in bureaucratic red tape. If Janella didn't submit the forms on time, she risked losing the land that had been in her family for generations. She hurriedly prepared her documents and set out on foot, hoping that the mild weather would hold and the lines at the office would be short. Meanwhile, Officer Zimmerman was cruising around in his patrol car, scanning the sidewalks for anything or anyone that might set off his well-trained prejudices. It wasn't long before he noticed a young black woman walking briskly, clutching a folder of documents to her chest. Somehow, that simple sight sparked his suspicion. He pulled over, stepped out of the car, and casually trailed behind her. Janella felt a creeping sense of unease. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the police officer. Quickly, she told herself there was no reason to panic. She was doing nothing wrong. All her life, though, she'd been told to be cautious around law enforcement. The warnings came from personal stories and the harsh realities that so many in her community faced. She slowed down just enough for him to catch up if he wanted to, yet she didn't wish to appear confrontational. After all, she simply had business to handle and wanted no trouble. "Excuse me," the officer called out, in a tone that was both commanding and condescending. She turned, feeling her stomach tighten. "Yes, sir?" she answered, maintaining politeness, but unable to hide the anxiety that flickered in her eyes. "You look like you're in an awful hurry," he said, crossing his arms. "Mind telling me where you're heading? I have some paperwork to file," she replied, her voice catching a bit. "I'm heading to the municipal offices." Zimmerman sized her up, his eyes drifting to the folder in her arms. A sneer curled on his lips. He was already trying to mentally justify any reason to detain her. "Let's see some ID," he demanded. Janella slowly retrieved her wallet from her bag, careful not to make any abrupt moves. She'd seen too many cautionary stories. She handed over her driver's license, which identified her as a resident of Philadelphia, matching the address she'd written down on her forms. Zimmerman studied it for several moments longer than necessary, as though searching for a reason to be suspicious. "What's in the folder?" he asked. "Personal documents," Janella responded. She tried to maintain a firm but respectful tone. "It's regarding my grandmother's property." "I see," Zimmerman said, still not handing back her ID. He narrowed his eyes, glancing from the folder to Janella's face. "Mind if I take a look?" Though Janella knew her rights, she also knew refusing might set him off. In theory, she had every right to say no. These were private documents, and she was not under any legitimate suspicion. However, the tension in the air was palpable, and she didn't want to escalate a simple situation into a full confrontation. She reluctantly opened the folder, revealing pages stamped with official city seals, inheritance documents, and property deeds. Zimmerman barely skimmed the pages, likely uncomprehending or uninterested. Instead, he was hyper-focused on how to spin this interaction into something he could control. "Are you sure all this is legitimate?" he asked, arching his brow. "Ever been arrested before?" Janella felt her cheeks flush. "Never," she said. "This is all legal and above board." In that moment, another officer might have simply wished her well, handed back her ID, and gone on his way. But Zimmerman was different. He'd already latched onto the idea that she was suspicious. Maybe he saw a potential statistic to pad his record, or maybe it was a deeper prejudice, a compulsion to dominate and belittle. In a heartbeat, he made a decision that would alter both their lives. Before she could take another breath, Zimmerman dropped her license into his pocket and told her she was being detained. Shock gave way to indignation, and she demanded, "On what grounds?" But her protest fell on deaf ears. He grabbed her arms, forced her to the ground, and pressed a knee into her back as he fumbled with handcuffs. Her documents spilled onto the sidewalk, and passers-by, uncertain of the context, froze in alarm. Tears of humiliation and terror welled in Janella's eyes as Zimmerman radioed in the arrest. She was accused of resisting arrest and obstruction of justice, empty charges that would echo in the police reports. Janella kept repeating, "What did I do? Please tell me what I did wrong." But Zimmerman offered no clear explanation. A small crowd began to gather. Smartphones emerged, capturing bits and pieces of the scene. Some onlookers shouted words of encouragement to Janella, urging her to stay calm. Others confronted Zimmerman, asking why he was doing this. He barked at them to step away, threatened them with arrest too, and marched his new prisoner to the patrol car. Janella was brought to a local precinct, a nondescript building on an unremarkable street, yet a place that loomed large in the community's collective consciousness. Its fluorescent-lit hallways reeked of disappointment and fear. In the holding cell, Janella wondered if anyone would believe her side of the story. She prayed that at least one witness had captured enough footage to prove she was innocent. It wasn't long before a desk sergeant compiled a preliminary report, heavily reliant on Zimmerman's statements. The narrative painted Janella as uncooperative and combative. It claimed she'd refused to show ID and had shouted profanities at the officer, gross distortions of the truth. She was scheduled for an arraignment. If convicted, she risked tarnishing her record and possibly losing the inheritance, as the city's legal labyrinth would devour her time and resources. Janella's friend, Aisha Wilson, was a paralegal at a nearby law firm. When she heard the news, she sprang into action. Aisha was relentless in her pursuit of justice. She rallied local activists, attorneys, and community members, all determined to clear Janella's name. The story circulated on social media. Short videos of the arrest began trending on Twitter, Instagram, and local Facebook groups. Outrage swelled. How could this happen in broad daylight? How does someone get arrested just for walking to the municipal office? People demanded accountability. Philadelphia's robust activist community wasn't new to these battles. They planned to protest, but first they needed every shred of evidence possible. Aisha formed a small volunteer group that scoured every corner of the internet for more cell phone footage, eyewitness statements, or any sign that Zimmerman had acted improperly. Within days, they discovered that Officer Zimmerman had a history of complaints, mostly from African American residents. Mysteriously, each complaint had been dismissed or resolved quietly with minimal discipline. It reeked of systemic prejudice and internal cover-ups, a scenario that had played out in numerous precincts across the country. Meanwhile, locked in her cell, Janella felt a swarm of conflicting emotions. One moment she was furious at the blatant injustice. The next, she was flooded with a quiet fear, unsure if the world believed her story. Each day, she fought to keep her spirit intact, reminding herself of the strong woman her grandmother had raised. Her first court appearance arrived. Dressed in borrowed clothes that Aisha had brought, Janella stood before a judge. Flanked by a public defender she'd only met minutes prior, the charges read out were humiliating. The prosecution described her as a potential threat to public order, basing their claims on Zimmerman's official report. The public defender tried to argue there was little cause for arrest, but the judge seemed unmoved. Bail was set. On the bright side, her bail amount was not exorbitant, likely because the judge recognized the case was thin. However, Janella still needed help paying it. Aisha and members of the community pooled funds to secure her release. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Janella stepped into the crisp outside air, free for the moment, but burdened with an upcoming trial date and a shattered sense of peace. Once released, Janella was more determined than ever to fight back. She joined forces with Aisha and local activists to gather evidence of racial profiling and excessive force by Zimmerman. Their biggest challenge was that the existing videos, though incriminating, didn't capture the entire encounter. It was possible for Zimmerman's defense to argue that something off-camera had justified his aggression. That was when an unlikely ally emerged, a reclusive neighbor named Miguel Santos. Miguel lived in a 4-story apartment building across the street from where the arrest took place. He was a security camera enthusiast, some might even say fanatic, wanting to keep tabs on any potential crime in the area. He had installed cameras that pointed in multiple directions, capturing angles of the sidewalk and street. On the morning of Janella's arrest, one of his cameras had been running. Normally, he never paid attention to the footage unless he saw damage to his property. But he'd caught wind of a local rumor. Police might have arrested an innocent woman right outside your building. Out of curiosity, he reviewed the tapes. Miguel was shocked by what he saw, Zimmerman trailing Janella like a predator stalking prey. The footage included audio, faint but clear enough to show that Janella had cooperated and had never refused to show ID. In fact, her calm tone and repeated requests for clarification starkly contradicted Zimmerman's official statement. As soon as Miguel realized the significance of his footage, he sought advice from a friend who worked in a local councilman's office. The friend directed him to turn over a copy to Janella's defense team. By that evening, Aisha had the video in her possession, and a wave of relief washed over the entire team. They had their smoking gun. However, the next step was precarious. They needed to ensure the video remained secure and free from tampering. They decided to distribute copies to trusted community leaders, a civil rights lawyer named Trevor Brooks, and the local chapter of a nationally renowned civil rights organization. By the following day, the footage was also discreetly shared with a local investigative journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer, a real name that carried the weight of journalistic integrity. Their contact, a seasoned reporter named Marcia Thompson, had built a reputation for exposing police misconduct. She smelled a big story. As the wheels of justice continued to turn, tensions rose within the police department. Some of Zimmerman's colleagues distanced themselves from him, sensing the potential fallout. Others closed ranks, determined to protect one of their own. Unbeknownst to Janella and her supporters, there were people behind the scenes trying to discredit the video, label it as doctored, or claim it was incomplete. But the timestamp, the metadata, and the original device were all intact. It would be next to impossible to dismiss its legitimacy. On the personal front, Janella struggled to sleep, haunted by nightmares of the arrest and the thought that she might end up behind bars again for something she didn't do. She confided in Aisha that she feared not only for her freedom, but also for her physical safety. Occasionally, she thought she saw Zimmerman's patrol car near her apartment at odd hours, as if he were surveilling her. When she mentioned it to Aisha, they decided to be proactive. They documented every time they spotted him lurking, noting down dates, times, and any details that might help if another incident arose. Then, one unexpected twist changed everything. Amid the clamor to figure out why Zimmerman had fixated on Janella, a rumor began circulating in hushed tones around the precinct. Something about Zimmerman's father and a lawsuit decades ago. A lawsuit that involved Janella's grandmother and a property line dispute in North Philadelphia. The rumor suggested that Zimmerman carried a vendetta tied to an event from his childhood, a vendetta that might have been reignited when he read Janella's name on those property documents. No one knew for sure if that rumor was valid, but it set off alarm bells for the legal team. They started digging into real estate archives and discovered a case from 30 years prior, a boundary conflict between the Carters and a Zimmerman family member. The Carters won the case. In the process, Zimmerman's father had been exposed for forging land deeds in an attempt to claim ownership of part of the Carter property. The court's ruling forced him to forfeit certain land rights and publicly acknowledge the falsification. It had been a scandal at the time. The story eventually faded from public memory, but evidently not from the Zimmerman family's personal lore. And so the puzzle pieces began to fit. It seemed plausible that Robert Zimmerman recognized the Carter name and had seen his chance for revenge. This was no random arrest, no mere act of over-policing. It was something darker and more personal. If that angle could be proven, it would dismantle Zimmerman's defense that the arrest was based on suspicious behavior. It would also expose him as someone who used the badge to settle old family grudges. Meanwhile, Marcia Thompson at the Philadelphia Inquirer was preparing an investigative piece that laid out all these details. Zimmerman's pattern of racial profiling, the footage from Miguel's camera, the old property case, and the deep animosity linking Zimmerman's family to Janella's. The day the story hit both the print and digital editions, public sentiment exploded. It was no longer just a local matter. It was a citywide scandal. Even major news networks briefly mentioned the story, pushing the Philadelphia Police Department into a defensive position. Calls flooded into the department's public relations office, demanding answers. Elected officials began speaking out, some calling for Zimmerman to be suspended pending investigation, others calling for more widespread reform in the precinct. Public outcry and mounting evidence finally forced the district attorney's hand. The DA dropped all charges against Janella. Moments after receiving the news, Janella sank to her knees, tears of relief streaming down her face. But she wasn't satisfied with just a dismissal. She filed a civil suit against Zimmerman and the Philadelphia Police Department, alleging wrongful arrest, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations. The suit sought compensatory damages, but more importantly, demanded policy changes to address racial profiling. The legal battle that followed was intense. The department's lawyers attempted to portray Zimmerman as a lone wolf, distancing themselves from his actions. However, with each piece of testimony, it became clearer that Zimmerman was not an isolated problem. He was a symptom of a broader institutional attitude that had consistently let him off the hook. He'd faced prior complaints and internal investigations. In each instance, he had received minor reprimands, if any punishment at all. This pattern painted a damning portrait of complicity. During the civil trial, Zimmerman took the stand in a last-ditch effort to salvage his reputation. He insisted he had no memory of his father's legal feud with the Carter family and claimed he was simply protecting the neighborhood from a suspicious individual. Under cross-examination, Janella's lawyer, Trevor Brooks, presented one piece of damning evidence after another: archived property disputes, text messages Zimmerman had sent to a colleague mocking so-called victims of police brutality, and finally, the unedited security footage. When the tape played in the courtroom, the narrative Zimmerman had spun unraveled completely. He could offer no plausible explanation for why Janella's calm compliance appeared so different from the hostile behavior he'd described in his arrest report. Stammering, he tried to shift blame, saying the audio was unclear or the angle was misleading. But the damage was done. His credibility crumbled like a house of cards in front of the judge, jury, and a gallery packed with reporters, activists, and local residents who had followed the case from the beginning. The verdict was swift and decisive. The court found in Janella's favor, awarding her a substantial sum in damages. More crucially, the judge urged the Philadelphia Police Department to review its oversight policies. Though the police department tried to spin this as a single case of one rogue officer acting out of line, they couldn't escape the wave of scrutiny that followed. And as for Zimmerman, his badge was revoked, and he faced the very real possibility of federal charges stemming from falsified reports and civil rights violations. But justice didn't end there. Hard karma was how Janella's grandmother would have described what happened next. In the months that followed the trial, Zimmerman's personal life disintegrated. His wife filed for divorce, unwilling to stand by a man who had become a national symbol of racially motivated abuse of power. He lost friends who had once admired him for his tough stance on crime. No longer shielded by the uniform, he faced joblessness and ostracism. Harsh words and condemnation trailed him everywhere he went. Rumors swirled that a local real estate developer who had once promised him a security job quietly backed out, not wanting the negative PR. As if that weren't enough, Zimmerman's father, now elderly and living in an assisted living facility, cut off ties with him. When confronted with the old property dispute scandal that had been dredged up in court, the father admitted to forging documents and defrauding the Carter family. The weight of the renewed scrutiny caused him unbearable shame. In a twist of irony, the father blamed Zimmerman for stirring up the past, for bringing the family's old sins back to light. The father insisted he had buried that dark chapter decades ago, only to see it splashed across headlines now. In contrast, Janella's life slowly began to realign with hope. After receiving her settlement, she used a portion to help fund legal clinics for underserved communities. She knew her grandmother would have wanted her to use any good fortune to uplift others. The rest, she invested in the property that had started this entire nightmare. She repaired the old house, turning it into a small cultural center where local youth could gather for tutoring sessions, music lessons, and community workshops. She named it Carter's Corner in honor of her grandmother's legacy. The center became a beacon in the neighborhood, symbolizing resilience and unity. Aisha, inspired by the whole ordeal, enrolled in law school. She was determined to become a civil rights attorney. Watching Janella fight a system rigged against her had ignited a fire in Aisha's heart. She wanted to be the advocate who stood up for others when they couldn't stand for themselves. Janella continued working at her law firm job for a while, but with the new responsibilities of running Carter's Corner, she eventually shifted her focus to full-time community development. The local press hailed her as a hero, someone who had taken tragedy and injustice and turned them into an instrument for empowerment. The story also had a ripple effect across the city. Public outcry over Zimmerman's actions pressured local officials to introduce new legislation mandating body cameras for all on-duty officers. Though these reforms were met with resistance from certain factions of the police union, public opinion demanded progress. A council member introduced a civilian oversight committee bill that would empower an independent body to review misconduct complaints. Over the course of the next year, the measure gained traction, and eventually a pilot program was implemented. In the midst of this social awakening, people who had once felt voiceless found the courage to speak up. Others came forward with their own experiences of profiling and excessive force by Zimmerman, recounting times he had used intimidation tactics to squash any potential complaints. Many of these stories were never formally investigated, but now, spurred on by Janella's victory, they sought legal recourse. Some cases were reopened, shining a harsh spotlight on the failures of internal affairs to hold officers accountable. Across Philadelphia, the once silent majority began to talk openly about institutional racism within law enforcement. Community groups organized forums where residents and officers sat side by side, airing grievances, discussing solutions, and forging tentative new paths of collaboration. The tension was still there, these issues ran deep, but at least dialogues were happening in the open rather than festering in the shadows. And what about Zimmerman himself? As the months wore on, his mental health declined. He spiraled into bitterness, convinced that he was a victim of cancel culture. He hopped between low-paying jobs, struggling to find a foothold. Each time he applied for a position requiring a background check, his record of civil rights violations came up, slamming door after door in his face. The media eventually lost interest in him, but the stigma of his actions persisted. In a dark, ironic twist, Zimmerman ended up living in a cramped studio apartment not far from the site of Janella's arrest, though in a far rougher condition than her own. He often spotted the shiny plaque of Carter's Corner as he walked by on the opposite side of the street, never daring to come too close. The vibrant paintings on the building's exterior and the laughter of kids inside stood as a constant reminder of how his attempt to oppress someone had given rise to a legacy of community empowerment. Occasionally, local volunteers or staff members at Carter's Corner would notice a shadowy figure watching from across the street. For a moment, they might guess it was Zimmerman, but they never approached him. Perhaps they felt pity, or perhaps they didn't wish to rekindle his presence in their lives. As long as he remained at a distance, there was little to fear. Janella focused on her mission, which was to uplift others, not dwell on vengeance. She found solace in the knowledge that true justice had prevailed and that her victory extended to everyone who had ever been profiled or mistreated by an unjust system. In the end, Janella's story became a symbol of resilience, of how one woman's stand against a racist cop not only liberated her, but also spurred a much larger movement for accountability and reform. She often remembered her grandmother's words, "Hold your head high and your heart open, and no matter what they do, they can't take away your dignity." And indeed, Janella emerged with her dignity and her spirit intact, serving as an inspiration for countless others who realized they too could demand and receive justice. Thank you for journeying through this poignant story of injustice, determination, and the triumph of truth. Janella's ordeal reminds us that one person's courage can spark real change, exposing corruption and forcing those in power to answer for their actions. Her victory isn't just hers, it represents every individual who has ever stood up to say, "Enough," and refused to be silenced. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your engagement amplifies tales like Janella's, helping them reach those who need a reminder that justice can and does prevail. It also allows us to keep sharing powerful stories that inspire, inform, and unite us all. Let's continue to shed light on injustice and push for a world where dignity and equality are not privileges, but rights for everyone.